Children are often the most vulnerable to disaster risk, but we feel that we're not able to protect ourselves fully from the risks and troubles presented. We need people with power to prioritize our welfare before, during, and after disasters.
Education is really important for children, as having more information in disaster risk reduction will reduce our vulnerability. The right sort of education is also important, as children are often taught at and gain no practical skills. Education on DRR needs to be fun and needs to suit the age of the children being taught. To make sure we are engaged in learning about disaster risk reduction, we have the right to be involved with DRR. As children know what appeals to other children, and so we feel our opinions concerning about disaster risk reduction should be heard.
For the next few minutes, we'd like you to listen to our experiences with DRR and how we feel that children can be protected from disasters. To start off with, I'd like to talk about a case study that we've been doing in my IB geography class. In the year 2009, a strong earthquake hit China that devastated the northern provinces. In particular, schools were targeted because due to poor quality building, many children were killed during the collapse of the buildings. The children were unprepared and did not know what to do during such an unpredictable disaster. Evidently, more needs to be done to prevent such atrocities from happening. In the year 1991, a strong and destructive typhoon hit the Philippines, destroying schools and houses, and many were left homeless, and classes were suspended for 2 months. After years of recovery, the Filipino government now builds schools and school buildings that are strong enough to withstand the typhoons. These two contrasting examples show the differences in infrastructure between the two countries, and we feel that infrastructure should be increased and buildings should be built to reduce future risk of children so that it can save more lives. This is precisely what DRR is all about, reducing risks of disasters and having the knowledge and management for when a disaster does strike. To sum it up, it is preparedness.
And one of the simplest ways of reducing people's vulnerability to these disasters is to teach them what to do in a disaster situation, or in short, it's DRR education. Recently, I learned that in the International School of Geneva, the students don't know what to do if there is a typhoon or an earthquake. Although they are not in a place at risk from these disasters, they should still conduct drills and simulation exercises because it is important. It is a very important knowledge to have. Engaging the youth to these DRR-related activities, for example, last summer in our municipality in the Philippines, there was extreme heat. Since most breadwinners in the family are farmers, and this is how the children could eat 3 meals a day. Due to the drought, some children had incomplete meals and they were hungry during the rest of the day. After months of this incident, children suggested that they would plant backyard vegetables so they could now have 3 meals a day. We play a role that could be an instrument that could create an atmosphere of awareness, and we are doing this for a better world and a better future.
Just like Anya and Tricia, Johnson and I believe that children are the most vulnerable to disasters, for often they represent more than a third of disaster victims. Examples would be such countries as China, as Anya and Tricia already mentioned, or El Salvador. We strongly believe that through educating children at a young age about DRR and by involving them in disaster management work, we can reduce their vulnerability to natural disasters. But both Johnson and I come from countries that are susceptible to natural disasters. Those disasters may not have affected us directly, but they have affected those that we love, be that our relatives or our friends. Each of us will give an example of a disaster that is personal to us, and thus show you why children are the most vulnerable and how through education about DRR, we could reduce their vulnerability.
I am Johnson from Kenya, and I thereby recall a severe drought that affected my area. The drought affected the crops that were in the field, thus reducing the crop produce. Thereby, the community members, and including the children, had to spend a lot of time looking for food and water. The Kenya Red Cross inspired me to disaster reduction after they provided relief food and raised awareness and educated us about disaster risk reduction. as the effect of this, we the children were involved in tree plantation. I believe that if it was not that we were educated about disaster risk reduction, we could not have done tree plantation activities. So I believe that education about disaster risk reduction is vital for achievement in disaster risk reduction. This has made me also that to believe that the government has need to make curriculums that involve children in leading about disaster risk reduction. This education may be offered through creating curriculum that focuses on disaster issues, media session, and initiating platforms that will involve children, rather than also involving like the platform we are having now is just involving the adults, but I am advocating that there should be need for children-based platforms of disaster risk reduction. I thank you for listening to me.
So, my name is Stella Mirzoyan. I'm 16 years old, and I come from Yerevan, Armenia. Some of you might know that Armenia is located in the Alp-Himalayan region that has a relatively high risk to earthquakes. The disaster that I'm going to talk about is the earthquake in Spitak that happened on 6th of December, 1988. It was a relatively small city in the northeast of Armenia. But the damage that this earthquake caused made it the largest earthquake disaster since a 7.8 magnitude earthquake in Tangsten, China, which killed more than 250,000 people in 1976. This earthquake had a surface wave magnitude of 6.8 and a local magnitude of 7.2 on the Richter scale. Its intensity was graded as disastrous. Geologists have located a 1.6 meter high, 18 kilometer long scarp just southeast of Spitak, where fault movement broke the surface. Historically, this area has experienced damaging earthquakes before. However, the government was still not prepared to the impact of such an earthquake. This earthquake in 1988 wiped out the entire city of Spitak, leaving it destroyed. The tremor also caused damage to many other surrounding cities and villages. The earthquake wave also reached the capital city, Yerevan, where I was born. However, it did not cause great damage. But from what I've heard from my grandmother, who was at her mother's house on the outskirts of Yerevan at the time, they were preparing salad from a party and then remember not being able to do so because the furniture was sliding about the apartment. From what I've heard from my mother, she was at university at the time having an exam, and she remembers her table jumping up and knocking off all her work. And from what I've heard from my aunt, who was just a little girl at the time, home alone, all the furniture in the house was shaking and some paintings on the walls got knocked off. The infrastructure of Spitak, particularly schools, performed very poorly in the earthquake, and this resulted in many of the 50,000 lost lives. It has been estimated that if the earthquake occurred just 5 minutes later, the children would have been on their way home and would have escaped the collapse of their unstable school buildings and been spared. Most of the hospitals in the area, like schools, were completely destroyed. A large number of medical facilities were destroyed, killing 80% of the medical professionals. The high death rate was greatly attributed to the way the buildings fell apart. So the entire town of Spitak, with 25,000 inhabitants, was completely destroyed, and it had to be built over the wreckage. The earthquake occurred, just like I said, at 11:41 local time, when children were at school and most youths were at university. Most of the buildings in the town were multi-storied. Thus, during the earthquake, the top floor, the floors collapsed onto each other, killing almost everybody on the ground floor. When I was studying in my public school in Yerevan, I heard from my 70-year-old geography teacher, who was at the time volunteering to help with the town recover from the aftermath of the earthquake, that her and some other volunteers found a brother and a sister whose family was living on one of those ground floors. Their mother and father died, and the only reason why they were spared is because when the earthquake wave hit their apartment block, it knocked off the cupboard with all the food onto them, and they were trapped in the corner of the building. Thus, they did not die. The only reason why they were found by the volunteers and my geography teacher was because they were fighting over the last orange that was left in the cupboard. As reported, the age groups most affected in this earthquake were children and youths who were trapped in their school buildings and university buildings. There was no established evacuation plan that people could follow. And one of the main reasons why this disaster was this destructive was the poor infrastructure of the buildings. In this disaster, those children that survived lost their homes. They were left without parents in shelter and had no idea what to do. They were almost left to cope with the aftermath of the earthquake on their own. Education was completely stopped, and the town is still being rebuilt, even though it happened so many years ago. I feel very strongly about this because after all of that, in my public school, we're not taught how to cope with such earthquakes, even in a geography course. And the only reason why I was taught so by my geography teacher is because she witnessed the aftermath of this earthquake in Spitak. I think that just by educating children in school about what to do in case of such a disaster, it would reduce their vulnerability to them. It would really make a difference. All the points Johnson and I mentioned are in the Children's Charter. By signing up to the pledge, you can show your support and really improve the situation of the children around the world. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Stefan Gutnick-Allen, and I am a student at the International School of Geneva. And with Andre, we're going to be discussing some brief oversights and some misconceptions that there are about DRR. So, Andre.
Thank you. Again, I'm Andre, and I greet you good afternoon. I'm going to tell you a story about our community and how it's adapting to climate change and how is it, what are the activities that we are doing in order to fight it. Education is very important for every individual, and it is also our right. But sometimes, in simple instances, it is being interrupted. In our community, we have a school that is some 5 kilometers from our residence. Most of the children are walking, but in my part, I am one of the privileged few to have a motorcycle and ride on it. But there is a problem when it's raining. During rainy days, our roads are becoming slippery and wet, and we are having a hard time going to school because it's hard to drive with a motorcycle on a wet road, especially that our road is not concrete. It is made just of land. But it's quite easier for us. The persons that are most affected are the ones who are walking because they got all wet on the rain. And because it's raining and they are being slowed down by the rain, they got to school late. And when they got to school, they got sick because they got all wet. So that's one of the problems in our school. During rainy days, since our school is quite far from our residence, we're having a hard time going to school. And some of us do not go to school because it's raining. So it's one of the instances that education is being hindered.
Yeah. As is one of the first segments of the Children's Charter, that education must not be interrupted is clearly of much importance. Unlike in the example presented by Stella, it was actually not structural support that was that important in this case. It was communication lines and access to education, healthcare, and other things. If people can't get to where they need to go, then there's no point having good buildings. So in this case, it was something like that that's overlooked very easily by most people.
Thank you. And the next thing that we are going to talk about is the simple solutions of our community to spread information. Everyone has the right to information, especially in disaster risk reduction. One of the reasons why many people die in disasters is because they don't know how to adapt with it. They don't know how to survive. But not everyone have access to information in the same channels. As a student, my main access to information is, of course, the school, because in school, we are being taught about disaster risk reduction and other information needed in order to adapt to the changing climate. However, the out-of-school youth, or the OSY, together with the adults, are not going to school. So this is becoming a problem in our community. How can we spread the information if school is the main source of the information and not all the people are going to school?
One manner that Andre was talking to me about in implementation of communication spreading, in his, knowledge spreading in his community, was to do community showings of DVDs such as Tales of Disaster, which explain in a very visual and easy to understand way what to do in case of a disaster. It requires minimal time and effort and is very cheap. This means that most people can get access to education. For example, if you have parents who don't have children to go to school, it's not necessarily the best idea to simply teach drills and what to do in case of a disaster to children, because adults who don't have children won't get access to this information. So there needs to be better ways to spread it, as he did in his community.
Another way to spread the information is through what we call purok system. A purok is a house cluster in our community. In a purok, we are having meetings, monthly meetings about information that is being spread, especially in disaster risk reduction. It is also in the purok system that we are establishing early warning systems that warn people if there is an upcoming disaster in our community so that we can evacuate to safety. That's all.
Thank you.
Okay, just to conclude a bit of our presentation, we hope that you've learnt from and enjoyed our personal experiences and opinions on DRR and how children can be more involved. Each of our examples illustrate how children are so obviously impacted by DRR and how more needs to be done to include us in DRR. Each example links with one of the 5 elements that make up the Children's Charter for Disaster Risk Reduction. The 5 elements are: schools must be safe and education must not be interrupted. Child protection must be a priority before, during, and after a disaster. Children have the right to participate and to access the information they need. Community infrastructure must be safe, and relief and reconstruction must help reduce future risk. And finally, disaster risk reduction must reach the most vulnerable. We urge all of the delegates and all of the people who have been listening to sign the Children's Charter Pledge to prioritize children in DRR and make sure that children in the future are not as affected. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions, the floor is now open to questions.
I'd just like to ask, what do you think is the most important thing you've learned about DRR?
Okay, I can answer that question. Of course, being a student, the most important thing that I have learned in disaster risk reduction is how a young person like me could, I have the knowledge on what to do in a disaster. So, for example, during what I just shared about last summer, that we had extreme heat, or it was already a drought in our municipality. So all of the students there, they agreed that we should plant vegetables in our garden, because during those times we were really very hungry because food was scarce. And yeah, that's what I learned in disaster risk reduction. How about you other guys? You can answer to that question? Okay. You agree to my answer. Okay.
Thank you for a very good perspective from across the world.
You're welcome.
My question to you relates to the summing up comment where you said you wanted to make your building safe, your infrastructure safe for the children of the future. Well, those children will be your children. So the question I ask you is whether or not there's an emphasis on going into science and engineering so that you can be in positions to ensure that the infrastructures, the buildings, the roads are safe for the children of the future. And I say that because there is a shortfall in the number of youth going into science and engineering, and it cannot meet the capacity that the world needs.
Who wants to answer it? Okay.
I definitely think that you raise a very valid point, is that we do need to invest much more in infrastructure, but then also we need to think about what we can actually do. So if we can't always make infrastructure better, then there's simple solutions that can vastly increase the likelihood of people coping with disasters, such as the PROC systems was a very good example of that, or the community showings. Like sometimes you have to see what you can do and can't do, And so while that is a priority, increasing infrastructure and the safety, perhaps turning to other solutions can be a good way of dealing with that too.
Any more questions from the floor? No. Okay.
Perhaps I have one suggestion. If you have the opportunity to voice out, right, on behalf of the younger generation to the authorities concerned, you might want to suggest the inclusion of risk management as part of the academic curriculum. Because at the end of the day, when we are talking about DRR, it's about risk reduction. We cannot prevent natural hazards from occurring. That's the will of God. Now, the question is, how do you prevent? There's no working formula so far. But what we can do is, when catastrophe occurs, you could possibly attempt to reduce. And there are various mechanisms as part of risk management process. That is, to have early warning signals and whatnot. But what's important is, building on the human capital. Younger generations like you all, it's very important that you have knowledge so that you'll be able to live in a world more manageable and more controlled. That's my point. So you need to highlight that to the authorities concerned to include risk management as part of the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you for your point, and we all completely agree. Natural disasters are something that cannot be predicted or prevented, which is precisely why we believe so fully in the Children's Charter, because its aim is to reduce the vulnerability of children, to make sure that they are safer and to reduce the risk.
This might sound stupid, but what ideas do you have to reduce the risks?
The main idea that I think we've all been discussing is the importance of practical education. So students knowing what to do if a disaster does strike, which would then, that would stop them from being at risk. Other methods would be improving infrastructure of buildings and such things as Stella mentioned. I think that probably Andre has also a lot of, he mentioned earlier today in one of our conferences at the roundtable discussion, the different management schemes that he's involved with. So I'll pass it on to him so he can talk a bit more about that.
Apparently you have to talk about it.
In our community, so we have involved in practical activities like tree and mangrove growing, coastal cleanup, and proper waste segregation. These activities, I can say it has greatly helped us in reducing the risks of our community against disasters. So maybe if you're really wanted to be an advocate of disaster risk reduction, you can also try these activities.
I was just wondering, do you think that school is the ideal forum for the practical education about disaster risk reduction, or is it better to actually supplement it or even focus on extracurricular education or education that includes more of the community than just students at the schools?
Well, I personally believe, since we think that children are the most vulnerable, if we make disaster risk reduction and we teach them, if we make that an extracurricular activity, there is really no guarantee they will attend it. So I personally think that we should teach children about DRR. We should make it a part of the curriculum so that children learn what to do. Because normally, it would be, I don't know, it would be included in geography class or something. We do strongly believe that it has to be a part of the education so that people have to attend it, because some of them might not realize how important it is that they know what to do in case of a disaster.
Okay, well, just to add to that point, basically, although education is important and we believe that DRR should be introduced as part of the education, you are right, and a more community-based level also is effective for DRR concerning children. I think that's all we have time for at the moment, but thank you for attending.